Happy 2021. Welcome back, everybody. It has certainly been a roller coaster already this year. My goodness, right? From the events of January 6th to last week, it's hard to even encapsulate all those, not only feelings, but also all those impacts and all the ways in which I feel like our community can have some say, right? And some important contributions to make as we frankly rebuild trust and hopefully even that much more resilience, which is the upcoming theme of the themester this fall in our institutions. So very, very lucky and very thrilled to be launching now the 2021 Spring Colloquium Series to help us do that. If you haven't had a chance to kind of peruse the speakers this spring, they're really fantastic, right? They really run the gambit, starting with Doi, of course, today, who I'll probably introduce in just a second, from the School of Public Policy and Management and Fulbright University in Vietnam, to Marco next week, now the outgoing. We have a new president for the IASC, but Marco will be joining us. We have James and Jennifer Jenkins from Duke, Sarah Dansman, right, one of our own here at IU. And just go down every week. I'm frankly excited about for varying ways. So I hope you can join us as we go through this spring. Just a quick bookkeeping note. There's no research series this Wednesday. That doesn't start until next week. But we'll be launching that starting next week. So look for those announcements. And a few other just quick reminders. If you have recent publications or upcoming virtual conferences, et cetera, that you want to publicize in polycentric circles, our newsletter, just remember to let David know, and we'll make sure to get the word out on that. And of course, we're going to keep going with our governance roundtable of the Ostrom workshop, our Grow podcast. There's a number of already recorded episodes now that are going to be dropped in feeds very soon. And if you'd like to similarly be featured in the podcast, just let us know. We'd love to have your contribution too. So I hope you all had a wonderful, hopefully restful, somewhat peaceful and relaxing break. And thank you for joining. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in to the Colloquium series. So as I said, we're very lucky to be joined today by someone I know many of you know already, but just in case not, Doi Huynh from, as I said, the Fulbright University in Vietnam. He'll be talking to us about his work on public entrepreneurship, collective wisdom, and Doi Moi, which is renovation in Vietnam. It's a really interesting project, Doi. I really enjoyed having a chance to kind of go through it, and I look forward to walking through it with you now and discussing it from there. So without further ado, Doi, over to you, and thanks so much again for giving us the opportunity to dig in.
Okay, thank you. I would like to share my screen first. Thank you, Scott, for nice introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank the Ostrom workshop for choosing me as a fellow for this year. It's very special time. I have attended many events for over a year, and they are very helpful for me. I am honored to be a part of this community. It's really an honor. And my paper is based on a major piece of Lynn's works, especially her first work named Public Entrepreneurship, a case study in groundwater basin management. The topic of my paper is Public Entrepreneurship, Collective Wisdom, and Doi Moi or Renovation in Vietnam. The outline of my presentation after introduction, I go to the public choice and public entrepreneurship literature. And then I present the public entrepreneurship and collective wisdom for the of the Communist Party of Vietnam and the bottom-up reform in Vietnam. And I look at a little bit between why I think in the case of Vietnam War and the case of Vietnam and US dealing with the COVID right now, we call the soft and the hard, and then reflection and conclusion.
Excuse me, so Doi, could you adjust your slides? You're showing the slide you're talking about in the next one. It's a little bit confusing.
Thanks. So what? Yeah, we might have just gotten off one.
Wait for a moment. Maybe I said the wrong. This one. It right?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Yes, because I think I have two screens. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So if we look at this slide, I think that is the GDP per capita at the 2011 bright trend from 1990 up to 2018. So this is the arm former Communist Party for the Socialist Bloc. So you can see there are some kind of exceptional. So that is China, Vietnam, and Laos. And Laos, they are go to another kind of, I think, reform. They go gradual reform instead of big bang. So in this case, I think the question is why? There are two questions. Why Vietnam and China, for example, they can go gradual reform and then they achieve the high success. So in this case, I would like to focus on the case of Vietnam. So this paper will analyze the evolution of personal collective actions and public entrepreneurship that helped the Communist Party of Vietnam or the communist regime escape a collapse in the 1980s and apply gradual reforms to get significant achievement. So that is my focus of this paper. For the in this case, I use the public choice and public entrepreneurship literature to look on on it. In this case, we have the two branches of public choice theory. The first one, that is the famous saying of Marcus Ostrom, maybe many of you know. He said that he wrote that I think rational self-interest individuals will not act to achieve their common group's interests. So this brand is named hard public choice or zero contribution or irrational theory. So it means that for those approach for the collective interest usually sacrifice in the comparison to self-interest. But Eleanor Ostrom, she have another approach and I like it a lot. She wrote that individuals pursuing private purposes will also take proper account of public values. So this branch can look at it, we can soft public choice or contribution or rational theory. So it means that in this case, there should be, I think, rational collective action. The right collective interest have been considered instead of basically ignore like the other branch. And in this case, we have the very famous concept. In fact, I think it's first used by the Eleanor Ostrom, but the definition of Onsuler and Leberup is very clear about those kind of the people. The public entrepreneurs are energetic and their public sector leaders who are expand their scope and feasible action by mobilizing public support, modifying critics, securing resources, and managing conflicts, often through many years of planning and authorization and implementation. So this is in we look at in situation, and my paper from three conditions. For in this case, I call collective wisdom. So in fact, rational collective action, it requires three conditions. The first one, we need somebody to do that. So it means we need public entrepreneurship. The second one, we need strong governing and supporting coalitions. And the third one, we need pressure or aspiration or participation of long-term interest partner to make sure that the decision is good for the whole society. In this case, I look at the situation of the Vietnam Communist Party and why it is very interesting that why Vietnam can could win the two wars. The first one with the French and the second one with the American. And when the socialist system collapsed, and why Vietnam can be able to survive and reform and change. So interestingly, if we look at the Communist Party of Vietnam, since it established into 1986, in fact, it just was led by three figures. The first one, Ho Chi Minh, that is called the sound of the Vietnam Revolution. And the second one, Lê Duẩn, the man behind the Vietnam victory of the Vietnam War with the American. And the third one, Trường Trinh, is the top leader, and he can start the initiative for renovation in Vietnam. So if we look at the situation of Ho Chi Minh, in fact, he tried to went abroad when he only 21 years old, and he create the Communist Party for 20 years. He generate idea. He tried to join the Communist International in early 2020, and he formed the Communist Party in 1930. And interesting that he was sidelined by the Comintern, so it means Communist International. And then when the situation happened, he tried to hit the Communist Party. He changed the name. He pretend to show that and form a very broad coalition for Vietnam independence. It called the League for Independence of Vietnam, led by the coalition, and he tried to try to get support from the country against Japanese, like he got support from the Americans, the Chinese, the British. And interesting that at time he got trouble with the Soviet Union, especially with Stalin, the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. But he still navigate, to form the Communist Party and to navigate, to lead Vietnam to get independence and to win the first war with the French. It with very famous victory of Điện Biên Phủ. So that is the case of Ho Chi Minh. And the second one is the man behind the Vietnam victories. The Vietnam victory of the Vietnam War is the Lê Duẩn. So in fact, he was the top leader of the South section of the Vietnam Communist Party. But at that time, when the Geneva Accord signed between Vietnam and China, Soviet Union, France, and then, but at that time, the South was sacrificed. So the South section, they were very upset. So that is why when the North, the North leader, they made a mistake with the land reform. That is very terrible issue for Vietnam, and they promote Lê Duẩn to become the top leader of the country and the party. At that time, the first one, he tried to convince and force his comrades or the Communist Party member and the government officer to follow his initiative to liberalize the country, to unite the country. Instead of the other faction, they just live in two sides of Vietnam, stay peacefully like the North and the South of Korea. And the second one, I think he very skillfully in dealing with at that time Vietnam called two brothers. It means the Soviet Union and Chinese. So it is a long time, it's long struggle and very back and forth for the 1956 to 1960. He tried to build a warmness with the Soviet Union and practice plan with China. And from 1960 to 1960 to 1964, he tried to build a warm period with China and chilly period with the Soviet Union. And then from 1964 to 68, he tried to balance between the two. And then at that time, I think both China and Soviet Union didn't want Vietnam to pursue the war in the south. But basically, Lê Duẩn and his colleagues ignored it and tried to do what Vietnam want. And then after the victory, Vietnam gradually distant and disbanded the relationship with China, and then build a relationship with the Soviet Union. At that time, it is very costly decision for Vietnam. And even I think Lê Duẩn and his colleagues play in really good game in the war with the U.S. Here and with the south of Vietnam. So in this case, it's really interesting to look at the soft and the hard approach here. So if we look at the situation of the North, in the north of Vietnam and the communist side in the south of Vietnam, they are decisively, they determined to liberate, to unite, unify Vietnam. So at that time, some kind of collective wisdom happened. So the Communist Party leader, they try to compromise. They try to bring consensus and generate support that to lead into the war. in that case, if we look at the what happened in the US in the US and in the South Vietnam. So that is exactly I called the Richard Nixon telephone with Henry Kissinger that he said that let's be perfectly cold-blooded, but about it. I look at the time of history. Out there, South Vietnam probably can never even survive anyway. I mean, you got to be, we had we also have to rely Henry's that winning an election is terribly important. So it means that in Richard Nixon mind, just for his own interest winning the election, that is the top. So we know what happened with Nixon during that term. A lot of things, similar situation happened with Ngô Đình Diệm, with Nguyễn Văn Thiệu, the president of the South of Vietnam. He just sit for his own interest. So it time there some kind of debate. But we look at the situation, it's very different between two sides of the Vietnam War. And the third person in this case, it is the Trường Trinh, the top leader when Vietnam faced life or death, or in brink of collapse when the socialist system collapsed. And then he tried to he tried to change and persuade the system to change that is the Trường Trinh. So that is why I think they call Ho Chi Minh City as the south of Vietnam Revolution, and they consider Trường Trinh as the builder and the commander for the way to lead Vietnam to get independent in the 1945, and then the winning the first Vietnam War with the French from 1945 to 1954. And then he sidelined for a while, but he still keep power. And then when Lê Duẩn dies in 1986, and he become the supreme leader, and then he lead Vietnam to Doi Moi, and with the change from abolish the central planning system and to trend to the market economy, and Vietnam achieved very high growth as I showed before. So in this case, but interesting that if we don't have time, but I just said briefly that the reform in Vietnam is the bottom-up reform. It's not from top down. A lot of government officials in province, in locality, they try to have some initiative. And the end, the time come up with when the socialist system collapsing, Vietnam still find a way to escape it and become the good one. In this case, if we look at the three conditions for collective wisdom, that in this case we see highly entrepreneurship and practical choice of Ho Chi Minh, Lê Duẩn, and Trường Trinh. As Ho Chi Minh said, I am a communist, but what is important to me is the independence and freedom of my country. So it means that in the minds of Vietnamese revolutionaries, this is the independence of Vietnam, the development of Vietnam, not because the ideology of socialism or something else. And they tirelessly efforts to build coalition and seek external support. Sometimes they seek from Soviet, sometimes they seek from China, and even though they seek support from the US. And they try to keep the unanimity of the Communist Party. It is very important for them. Sometimes they can put their self-interest or they put their fraction aside a little bit to get compromise. And in fact, they face very strong external pressure, and they have aspiration to achieve independence for Vietnam and promote the country prosperity. So that if we look at the three conditions, it applies very good to the case of Vietnam and Vietnamese leader. So in short, so through the lens of public choice and public entrepreneurship, I examined indifference for Vietnam Revolution in Renovation in 1986, when the Socialist Bloc were falling apart. Vietnam Communist regime were in a brink of collapse. the findings show that public entrepreneurship and collective wisdom had played prominent roles. The communist regime had been able to lead Vietnam people to gain the national independence and train the development model to achieve high economic growth and inclusive development. So in this case, we saw that it's very clear that individual pursuing private purposes also take proper account for public value at Ostrom argument. So it happened everywhere in Vietnam and many settings. So that is why, so especially with the current situation of the world, we see that how to generate rational collective action for our world, for our community, it is very important. So that is on. I want to present briefly about my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stu. So first off, virtual round of applause. That was very well done. And you covered a lot of ground there, which I'm thankful for, but I know we're all going to take a minute to keep digesting. As I said there in the chat box, the queue is open if there are any students in particular or otherwise visitors who would like to help us jump in. And I'll give you folks just a second. If not, I'm happy to get us going. Yeah. Okay.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, no, for sure. No worries. No, Jamie, did you have one? I'm sorry.
No, but Gustavo was raising his hand.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Gustavo. I totally missed. Yeah, no, feel free. I missed you.
No problem. I was kind of doing several things at the same time.
I hear you.
I think I have a question. So it's but I didn't want to jump into the queue. So can I go? That's okay.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, if you'd like to. Good.
Cool. So it seems that it would be interesting, the comparison with North Korea, no? So it's like they went through, similar but dissimilar processes, but now North Korea ended up with kind of, at least from an economic point of view, a very close regime. And Vietnam, it seems that when I went through some kind of, reform, again, maybe I'm just because I'm completely ignorant of the historical details of the countries, but it sounds like an interesting comparison, at least to somebody that is not into the history of the two countries.
Great question. Yeah, do any thoughts along those lines? Have you considered that kind of comparative work?
I don't have a very good specific one about this topic, but because I think Vietnam and North Korea, a lot of people mention about that. So in fact, so if we look at what actually happened in the North Korea, it is not a communist regime. It is a feudal regimes. It's led by some kind of kings, right? Monarchy regimes. So that in reality, they say some kind of embarrassers. That is not collective leadership. This is only one man leadership. So that is the situation of North Korea. They use only the arms and their force and their apparatus to repress the people. Regardless of the happiness of the people, they should care about themselves. So in this case, so but in the case of Vietnam, if we look at from at the beginning, they have been collective leadership, and there have been compromise. Then they know what exactly Vietnam needs to be achieved. So it's interesting that from 1930 30 so far, the Communist Party of Vietnam, they made a lot of mistakes. For example, serious land reform in 1956, or they made serious mistake, even though I think in 1931, when they tried to have some armed struggle with the French at the time, and very blooded things happen. And then, but after that, when failures and mistakes happen, they look at it and they recognize it and they acknowledge them. And for example, in the case of 1956, the top leader, he resigns. But it indeed that when he resigned, he still kept into the top body of the leadership. They call the Politburo, and that is Trường Chinh, the person who led to Doi Moi. So with the current situation, if you look at the corruption, the anti-corruption campaigns in Vietnam, so in fact that happened thanks to some kind of collective action or collective wisdom for Vietnam. So in the early 2010s, so Vietnam faced very serious problem of corruption, and the country leader know that we have to do something. So whether we would be some kind of Indonesia under Suharto regime or Philippines in the Marcos regime with a lot of cronyism, skepticism or related issue. So that is why it is very interesting to look at in Vietnam why the collective action and the good outcome, especially when Vietnam faced the life or death situation, to be honest, not to be situation. Good things usually happen. So that is some kind of comparison between Vietnam and North Korea. Basically, two different regimes, type of regimes.
Excellent. No, excellent. Thank you, Gustavo. Thanks a lot, Du. Yeah, I'm sure that type of, comparative work. I'm just thinking North Korea, of course, for sure as well, but Cuba, even China to an extent would be really interesting. Because, as you say, a lot of those reform initiatives began, at least in the case I'm thinking of, China and to a certain extent Vietnam within about a decade of each other, and have had, very different, impacts, and, success stories as well as kind of cautionary tales. So that's something I just need to educate myself more on as well, frankly, because I think that would be fascinating. What other, looks like Jamie maybe perhaps is next, and then I have a quick one as well. And then if others would like to jump in, again, feel free to use the raise hand or the chat box. So Jamie, over to you.
All right, then. I have a couple of questions. And one is, I'd love it if you could explain a little bit more why you mentioned COVID at the end of your talk, because it doesn't appear in your paper at all. And so I was like, okay, Du is giving us something a little extra. So I'm hoping that you meant that to tease us and get one of us to ask you about that. So please do. And then the second one was sort of about the reference to public choice. And I just wanted to commend you for taking on Buchanan and Tulloch and reading the source, referring to those sources, because it's not light reading. But on page 3, you mentioned Tulloch. I don't know this work at all, but you're arguing that since ancient times, and I'm assuming you mean like Plato and Aristotle, mainstream political science theory assumed that political science was viewed simply as a matter of producing morally correct policies. And of course, I'm not a political scientist, but something that I've learned from music anyways is that sometimes our theories, they're not supposed to be like morally prescriptive as they are descriptive of things that happened in the past. And so I see that sort of same thing going on, say, when we read Adam Smith, for instance, which, we kind of blurs the lines of politics and economics. So I wonder is there some of that going on as well in public choice? I don't know. I think that's a question that I have, though. Is some of that descriptive as much as it is prescriptive? And here's why that question is important to me, because Vincent Ostrom cautions us to think about what has been done in the past, and to think about the human intentionality of the structures that are already built before we prescribe more policy. So Mike, sorry for those complicated questions, but I'd love to know what you think.
The first one, I would like to answer quickly about the COVID happened. I think that is very interesting to look at some kind of collective action and things related to that. If I name the number in Vietnam, there are less than 2,000 cases with only 35 deaths. With a country with 96 million people, it's not several million. Just think about that. In this case, I think Vietnam put the COVID into the war situation. So I think if we look at the history of Vietnam, when we are at the war situation, everybody just basically follow instruction of the government and follow, I think, what the whole society want to do. Well, for example, when the government order everybody should be distancing, social distancing, wear the mask, and try to apply some strict situation. Everybody in the whole society follow that, even though somebody violate that. The whole community come to criticize those people. So it means that the discipline of the whole society is very strong. So if we compare the situation in the US, because people follow with the mind of the liberal or something like that, but in this case, we see that some kind of negative externality. So you didn't follow social distancing. You didn't wear the mask. It's only for problem for yourself, but for the whole society. So it means that if we look at people just follow their self-interest, they sell everything and create a big problem for the whole society. So that is why I look at the situation, because right now I'm in the US here, so I can observe a lot of things happen in the case of US, especially for the former president and for the from last previous term. So we know that I think how to generate, I think that some kind of collective, rational collective action. It seems that for lack that, but so that is why the COVID situation maybe partly it becomes so serious, because the lack of some kind of the generate collective action. But I would like to come to your second question. It's a more important. So that is a very interesting. So in the US, so a lot of people talking about democratic system. And for a long time, the US tried to bring the US model around the world. To teach Vietnam, you should follow it. To teach Iraq, you should follow it. To teach a lot of countries, to follow it. But I think when I look at many countries try to apply the democratic model, democracy, and but not many countries can be successful. So in fact, many countries fail. I think the very obvious model is in the Philippines in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, they have about more than 100 million people. They try to apply the US model from the late 19th century. It's over 100 years ago. But what happened with the Philippines now? We know that I think the current president, they order his staff to kill their people, right? For the drugs user or the people without any progressive process. So that is why I will look at it. So I wonder. So what happened with the democratic system, and with what happened with some kind of dictatorship, or where are they the main issue? So that is why I look at Aristotle's work, his politics, because he describes 6 kind of regimes. The country ruled by one person, a few people, and a lot. So he means that I think that the 3 kind of regime, that is the form one kind of unity or monarchy. The second one, he called that oligarchy, and the third one, democracy. So if we look at the situation of some kind of oligarchy, it is the case of Singapore. So in fact, from since the 1965 so far, Singapore basically ruled by the People Action Party, just a few people, just a small number of people, even though they have some kind of election, just basically the matter of in the handful people of the party. So we look at the situation opposite in the US. So in the US, it happened in many cases. So why such situation happened in the US, and why such situation happened in many countries, even though through the democratic process, but they still elect and they still choose some kind of popular leader. And some people, and when they become the leader, like Marcos in the case of the Philippines, and he become a dictator. Exactly, I think if when the Marcos were elected as the Philippine president, the time name hit the man of the years. And then think that because he studied at the law school and become a lawyer and a member of assembly and the chair of assembly and then be president. It's perfect process if we look at the democratic system. But in the end, he become a dictator. So that is why. So why we look at it, it's not because I think democratic or oligarchy or anything else. But in this case, Aristotle he described that there are some kind of good and bad governments. So good government is mean that for those they govern the government to pursue the collective interest. So it means the interest of the people of the country. And for the bad government, it means they just seek for their own interest. So that is why I put his government into the framework of public choice with the rational and irrational collective actions. It's very interesting that. So that is why in this case, if the US can have the very good government, so it means basically a lot of collective actions. It's good for the whole society. So if I think the bad government, it happened a lot around the world. We can look at Zimbabwe, we can look at a lot of countries. Basically, the government in the handful of people, they just do whatever for their self-interest. So that is why when we look at I apply the Aristotle form of government into our literature. It shows that it's really interesting for this situation. So is that address partly your concern or question, or you want to discuss a little bit more, Jamie?
Yeah, it's actually prompting.
Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
No,
Sorry.
it was actually prompting me to think, can you think about a dictatorship or even communism in terms of public choice? Because I know public choice was really developed to describe the process of crafting a constitution and getting consensus. And you don't have those kinds of things necessarily we don't think of those things as existing in a communist state, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Yeah, you've really opened up a very interesting multi-dimensional question there.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, I think your question is really interesting. So a lot of people just think that Vietnam Communist Party are communists. So in fact, they are nationalists. So they think about Vietnam. Mm-hmm. They think how to bring independence to Vietnam and bring the good life for Vietnamese people. Many of them, in fact, they didn't care much about the ideology of communism or socialism. So that is why, so when I look at, I think I called what Ho Chi Minh said, I am a communist. But the most important for me is the independence of my country. So he become a communist, a tool for him to bring the independence for Vietnam. He not want to become a real communist. So that is why when we look at a lot of, or even when we look at the case of North Korea, so a lot of people think that it is some kind of communist party, but it's not at all. It is some kind of monarchy system. So that is when we look at, from my viewpoint, we look at what actually happens instead of some kind of names or related something in the surface.
Excellent. No, thank you so much. And I'm cognizant of wanting to grab others into the conversation as well. Gustav, I'm not sure if your hand was from earlier or if that's kind of a new interjection you wanted to.
Can I go just one brief comment?
Oh yeah, no, sure.
So, just one brief comment related to public choice. I know that sometimes it's confusing, but be careful that public choice, authors wear both hats, the positive and the normative one. So to some extent, public choice started more as we want to understand how governments work, more as a descriptive, as a positive theory, because the standard was like welfare analysis and the normative approach for governments, okay? So, and they were kind of fighting against that view, but then they moved things to a constitutional level. And then when you think at the constitutional level, they kind of, some authors, they reintroduce these more normative elements. So that's why I think sometimes it's kind of, depending what you read, public choice could be confusing. Okay, sorry, that's just one brief comment that I think it's important.
No, it is important. Doi, did you want to respond to that before we move on?
So to be honest, that is very broad and very complicated literature about public choice. Somebody look at, I think, some specific mechanism. For example, the medium rules. It also, I think, a part of public choice, right? So a lot of some kind of people, how people vote in, especially for the democratic system. So, but in this case, I just look at, I think, the nature of collective action. So that is why I look at what I think Ostrom and Ostrom. They look at about the nature of human being. The first one, as Ostrom said, that self-interest people, self-interest individual, never pursues the collective interest. They didn't care. They never care. They just care about their self-interest. But in this case, especially we at the Indiana University, and we appreciate what Lynn's work. So that she showed that from her first work, he showed that I think okay, I think people self-interest, but not exactly. I think that also describe people university still care about the public interest. So that if we look at her whole life, so in fact, her whole life is what exactly she said. She just pursue, I think, what for the good public interest, and she tried to find mechanism, even though she create this workshop, right? So whether I think this workshop is for her own interest, maybe a little bit, but it brings a lot of, I think, good for the whole society. So that is why when I look at, I think, some organizations, some individual, I just look at the mechanism to generate rational collective action. So in this case, I think we look at, I think, maybe positive in terms of positive approach that I think what actually happened. So we don't wish people would do like this, would do like that for the whole society because their ethnic, the moral issue or something like that. Because if we look at the assumption of economics, just based on the motivation, based on incentive, but in fact they are mechanism for generating rational collective action. So in this case, I call the collective wisdom. That means a group of us how to sit together, how to work together to bring the good for all of us instead of only we just think about for ourselves and fail in generating the good collective actions.
Mm-hmm.
So Thanks. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much, Doi. No, this has been fascinating already. I'm just remembering back to, Vincent's questions about the state, right? And you'd think in a communist, society, that's even a more straightforward question. But as you're pointing out, Doi, that's not necessarily the case. And this is being interpreted in a lot of different ways around the world. Levon Schlegel, a professor at the Kelley School, has another question. And Levon, if you're on the line, please feel free. We'll turn to you next.
Unmute your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's my mistake. I do that every time.
Quite all right.
So I'm really interested in the more practical side of social and public entrepreneurship. My group does a lot of work in a number of countries, and I know how difficult it is when entrepreneurs, who by definition are a little bit more maverick in nature, who are certainly more or demand more freedom in managing their businesses, making decisions, choosing directions to go in. And the challenge that sometimes has in a more controlled society like Vietnam, like Myanmar, some of the other countries that we've worked in Africa. How is it doing in Vietnam, and what kind of measurable impact is this entrepreneurship in general having on the Vietnamese economy?
Thank you very much for your interesting but very challenging questions, especially for the situation of Vietnam. So just look at that 30 years ago, or over a little bit 30 years ago, in 1986, Vietnam applied the central planning model. So at that time, it liberalized the economy to apply market economy mechanism, for allocating, distributing resources. So the huge impact, the huge change happen. So in this case, we don't have the very clear measurement. So maybe you do some kind of tool, some kind of pre-research, but we should look at what about the result. What happened now? And in compared to the situation in 35 years ago. So we just look at some kind of there are some indicator. So if we measure the openness of the economies, and we add up some kind of the very simple measurement, that it is the import and export. So it means external trade compared to the GDP. So Vietnam, so it is just among the top of the world. So in the year in Vietnam, the total trade equal to 2 times of GDP. So that is the first one, that is in the case of Vietnam, and Vietnam among the top country with the current level can attract a lot of FDIs. So almost the big a lot of big companies like Intel or Samsung, Apple, and a lot of them big tech, they have office in Vietnam. And in Vietnam right now become maybe the biggest cell phone assembly for Samsung. And that's guy. And if we look at the number of enterprises in Vietnam, it along with the number of entrepreneurs in Vietnam, that in the late 1980, Vietnam had less than 10,000 enterprises. At that time, maybe Vietnam had just a few private enterprises, but right now Vietnam has about nearly 1 million. Just think about that number. And then if we look at the role of the private sector, and if we look at the competitiveness, because in entrepreneurship go along with competitiveness in some case. So Vietnam cannot compete with other country. It could not export a lot of goods. So that is why I know that it is very difficult to answer your question. But if we look at the case of entrepreneurship in Vietnam, I think it's very interesting. In this case, one thing is very important for Vietnam, that is the public perception. For a long time, Vietnam followed the feudal system. So the feudal system never appreciate businesses. Never appreciate entrepreneurship. They rank at the top, and because Vietnam go from the feudal system and then go to the communist system, for a long time the entrepreneur never appreciate. But right now that perception has been changed in Vietnam now. I think in Vietnam now become a lot of people admire about billionaire in Vietnam. A lot of people talking about entrepreneur, about businessman, a lot of things. So a lot of in this case, it means that people encourage, to do the new thing, rich thing, and more space and times. And in this case, it is very interesting to look at in the situation of Vietnam. So for example, at the normal situation, we know that in the public sector, people reluctant for change, reluctant to apply for the new things. That's because it is very risky, because government officials just for promotion and for their income. If they do something risky, it is very would be highly risky for them. But in Vietnam, the situation of Vietnam that because Vietnam facing life or death, to be honest, or not to be for many times, especially for the war. During the war, it cannot follow the procedure. It cannot follow the situation because Vietnam had to survive. And that's case, so that is why if we look at things happen in the war, so the entrepreneurship, it really in that it happened for the army leader because they have to think about creatively. For example, for the war with American, Vietnam in terms of arms or equipment, Vietnam must more or less advantage compared to the US and a lot of things. But Vietnam, the leader, the army leader and the country leader have to think creatively, actively. You have to think about how to win the war. So that I can see, to be honest, I must to answer that there are no specific research about the entrepreneurship in Vietnam. But if we look at about the culture and the history of Vietnam, there are a lot of space for those things happen.
Yes, I agree with that. I sometimes I'm curious about the idea of a little bit more closed societies and how they support that open business that entrepreneurs tend to be. And my impression of Vietnam is that there's a good balance there, that there's not a lot of over micromanagement of the entrepreneurship level, especially at the smaller end of that spectrum. And that's kind of allowed some interesting growth and some interesting development within the country. It wasn't a question, that one, as much as a comment.
Yeah. I would like to add a few about it. I think it's very interesting.
Please.
So in fact, Vietnam is not a closed economy as on. Especially for the last 30 years. So just look at the number I just showed you, that the FDI come and there are 4 million Vietnamese overseas. In the US, nearly 2 million people. So that is very close relationship, even though during the time Vietnam applied the central planning, the relationship between Vietnamese overseas and Vietnamese in Vietnam, they're very close. And the exchange idea, it's go back and forth a lot. So in fact, I think if we look at the situation of Vietnam, Vietnam has been invaded by China for 1,000 years. So then there are a lot of wars, a lot of things happen, go back, go forth to Vietnam. And so that is the running flows. The running flow in Vietnam is not some kind of isolated. Yes, but some, I think, witnesses of Vietnamese people that we only take things we just take things easy. Sometimes Vietnamese people not think about seriously about things, try to do a lot of things carefully. So that is because we know that the uncertainty of the war, the situation, we don't know what would happen tomorrow. So just look at for the short term first. So that is some kind of witnesses for Vietnam. People dare to take risks. But think about the long-term or related issue, that is some kind of witness of the Vietnamese people.
Great. Thank you.
I do. And thank you, Levan. Yeah, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
And then Soleil?
Yes, thanks for the interesting presentation. My question is about the transaction costs of public entrepreneurship in Vietnam. And since you engage in a comparative analysis in your paper, I was curious about, whether it regards to engagement between entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs' engagement with the bureaucracy or the central government institutions, the transaction costs in Vietnam was, was conducive for the kind of public engagement that you described us. So in other words, was it easy for these public entrepreneurs to benefit from state institutions to flourish? Or, some of the comparisons you gave regarding USSR or China, do you think that there are differences with regards to Vietnam in that case?
in Vietnam. So right now, because your question is my topic is about public entrepreneurship. So I work in the public sector, but you talk a little about for the entrepreneurs in Vietnam, about the opening companies and about how to running. What about the obstacle of the current institution, right? So that that I understand that in Vietnam. So in fact, there are two things. Right now, it's very easy to open businesses. It's quite simple. But the problem, because the reptile corruption and bribery, that is the nature of developing countries. Developing countries, that is a huge problem. So there are some research that in Vietnam, it's really interesting that is the VSAP. That the VSAP grant that is easy for the very big company to run business in Vietnam, and very quite simple for the small company to run business in Vietnam. But it becomes the huge burden for those guys in the middle. So that is why there are some kind of gap. So there are not many big companies. Yeah, so that is one of big problems in Vietnam. But the good thing in Vietnam, so I don't know why my country, I think, try to do it. But if you look at trade agreements, so Vietnam may be among the top country. We have agreement with Europe, we have agreement with the US and with many countries. And we join TPP and we join ASEAN Economic Community and a lot of things that. So that is some kind of agreement. So we bring international or external standard or practice come into Vietnam. So that help a lot. So that is one issue that is very important, that Vietnam, for those issues you talk about transaction cost, it related to one thing we call transparency. The more transparent, the less transaction cost. So that is why right now Vietnam try to apply some kind of doing business indicator by the World Bank or the competitiveness of the country by the World Economic Forum. Yes, we try to look at that. So what indicator Vietnam can improve? So that in fact it improved a lot. But compared to other countries, Vietnam is still a developing country with the income just about $3,000 per capita, or $8,000 in terms of purchasing power parity or related time. It's still at low end of the middle income. So a lot of things to go ahead.
Fantastic. No, great question. So I apologize for not having more time, Doi, because I feel like we're just been able to scratch the surface so far. To your earlier point, Jamie, and as you noted in your presentation, Doi, I think there could be a whole interesting follow-up study here, just looking at, COVID and how Vietnam has dealt with that, and from an institutional perspective, and what other, countries could learn there too. And as I said earlier too, this upcoming semester on resilience, that could be an interesting time, since if nothing else, Vietnam has certainly been resilient. There could be a neat way to kind of feature that in your research here, so we can be in touch about that. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have to pretty much conclude there. Do you have a final thought you wanted to leave us with, Doi, on the way out here?
Yeah, I think in this case, it's very good for me to have a lot of people have done study in this issue for a long time. For example, I got just the message from Chammy that I should look at more carefully about the Butcherman, because he seems more like soft than hard. Because to be honest, it's very difficult, because it's not easy to distinguish between the hard and soft. But in this case, I think the most important for us to think about, or for me to think about it, how to have the more rational collective action. Yes. So that is, I think, that is why I'm very honored to be in this community and to be in the Lean work. Because her work is how to generate, exactly, I think that she wants to do it, how to generate collective action for our society. So that is her whole life, it just focused on that one. So, and she achieved a lot. So I use that framework for this one, and to share with, I think, this group of people, I think that is great honor for me. I just want to thanks again, and thank a lot for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Doi. That was a wonderful, wonderful note to end on. And we really appreciate you and all of your great work too. So one last round of applause for Doi. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much all again for joining. I know it's a busy start to the term here, so we appreciate it. As a quick reminder, next week, so not this week, next week, we're kicking off our research series with an Ostrom book club with Bobby Herzberg from Mercatus and Vlad Tarko from Arizona, talking to us about their recent work, a discussion on the Bloomington School, which is going to be great. Ostrom's tensions and the intellectual biography there. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then next Monday, we have Marco, this now past president of the IASC, talking to us about his great work on commons governance. So until then, look forward to seeing you again virtually. Hopefully we can do this in person, maybe starting in the fall. But in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, any ways we can improve the series. Thanks again for joining. Thanks again to you, Do, and have a great rest of the afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Yes, thank you a lot.